I got it, I got it. I guess I'm making a Bargello quilt, and I'm giving it away. That's right, you heard me correctly. Tonight's quilt is a pattern requested by you, designed by yours truly, a free pattern featuring the Bargello quilt technique, and one lucky viewer is gonna win the finished quilt. Now, what makes this pattern unique, I think, is that it uses pre-cut 10-inch squares so that you can learn the Bargello technique without committing to doing a really huge, big quilt. So I'm gonna use the Boundless Collage pre-cut 10-inch squares and a fun pop of green and that nice white background. It's gonna look amazing. So first I need to decide what colors I wanna use in my Bargello quilt. With all these beautiful squares of fabric to pick from, it can be difficult to decide which ones I want to use. But what I'm going to do is put these in 6 groups of 5 different colors. So I just need to decide what colors I think would look nice together. Some pretty pinks, some purples. Not a huge fan of purple, but who knows, that might end up being a New Year's resolution or something. If you want to make them similar colors or contrasting, it doesn't matter. I just want to get them in some groups so I can get to the next step. Man, there's a lot of purple in here. Oh, don't you just love the feel of fabric? We have a term for it, you know, fabric fondling. I could sit here and just organize and play with this fabric all night, but then I wouldn't finish a quilt, and that's a problem if I'm giving it away, right? So I have first 3 groupings together, but I have to cut some of my green fabric before I can start making my Bargello. So there's a lot of different fabrics and prints and colors going on, and I knew I wanted there to be a cohesive, repeating color, and guess what? That's this green. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut these rectangles up to use in our quilt. And then the white is gonna act as the borders and also be part of the Bargello block as well. Now I have my borders cut, I have my little strips for the blocks, and all I have to do is get my first grouping of 10-inch squares and start cutting those. So I decided that these 5 colors would look great together, and what I'm gonna do is stack them up and cut them in half. And one half is gonna be used in one unit and the other half in the next unit. Now, since I'm dealing with 10-inch squares, I have to be very careful that I'm cutting it perfectly, or as perfectly as possible, because I don't have a whole lot of wiggle room. So I'm gonna cut that in half and separate them in their 2 parts. I'm gonna set one group aside. The other group is going to use my rectangles, some green pieces, as well as the white strips. So now it's time to lay out the pieces for the first unit of my quilt. I'm gonna start with 2 rectangles of my print fabric, and it can be any color that you want it to be. So if you want it to be scrappy, if you want there to be a color placement, whatever makes you happy. But then after those 2, I'm gonna have a white strip and then another fabric print. Now in this next spot, that's where my green rectangle is gonna go. That's gonna provide some cohesion, and it's really gonna make this quilt look fantastic. And then it gets another white strip, and then the last 2 are gonna go in place and then finish it up with another white strip. Now what I need to do is sew that together in one unit. The first unit is done. I've pressed it, and now I'm gonna make it into a tube so I can start cutting it up like a Bargello. It's basically gonna be folded in half, and I'm gonna sew along the top to create that tube. When you're laying out your unit, I want you to make sure that the fabric that was on the top is facing up. This is gonna be fabric number 1. It's gonna be important because here in a little bit we're gonna do some unstitching, and that's gonna help keep me on the right track. But using my rotary cutter, I'm gonna cut this in strips of varying widths. And if done correctly, your last strip should be exactly the perfect width, but I'm just gonna trim it up just a little bit. So now I have my 4 strips, which is good because I need 4. If I had more or less, that would not be what I wanted. Here's where it gets interesting. I know that I need to remove the first line of stitching, and what I like to think of as the first row, I'm gonna remove that first line. So right here, I'm gonna use my seam ripper and just carefully unpick that stitching and lay it open. And if you download the free pattern, it shows you exactly what to rip out where, so it's definitely handy to have if you're trying this out. Then, when I take out that stitching and I lay it open, there is the first part of my Bargello block. Now on my second row, I'm gonna remove the second row of stitching, and I'm counting from block 1, so that's why this would be the second. So Seems so weird using a seam ripper. I try not to rip out my mistakes, but this isn't a mistake, right? So it's almost like a seam helper or a stitch friend. I don't know, something like that. And then I'm gonna open it up. I know that it's going correctly because I have two different fabrics right here. If I had the same fabric, I know that something's off. This is my third strip, so I'm gonna count down to my third seam and do the same thing again. And you know you're doing it right when you start to see this green make that curve up. That's what I wanna see. Fourth one, so I'm gonna do the fourth seam and lay it out. And I'm gonna do each one of these units separately. I'm not gonna try to do a bunch at the same time because it gets really confusing with all the different colors. I wanna make sure I don't mess up and accidentally take out the wrong stitch or leave part of the block out because that is no fun trying to figure out what happened. Like that, you're like, that doesn't look right. That's because I have it turned around. That looks right. So I'm gonna sew the strips together, and these seams aren't necessarily gonna match up, so I'm not worrying about making each particular seam match up, but I do want the strips to end and start on the same spot. I'm gonna hold them together here, sew it together for my first part. And there is my first beautiful Bargello block. But using the other half of those same 10-inch squares, I've made the second exact same block. For the next block of this quilt, I'm gonna take another grouping of those 10-inch squares cut in half, and I'm gonna lay them out, but slightly different than I laid out the first ones. We're gonna have our print fabric, then I'm gonna add my green, a white strip, a couple more prints, another white strip, two more prints, and one last white strip. So I'm just gonna sew these together along the long edge, just like I did the first one. Now you might be surprised, but I do read the comments, and I did see that quite a few of you wanted a Bargello quilt. So of course I had to make it come together for you. And there were other comments as well. For instance, Nancy Brown, yes, I know you prefer white wine, and I know it wouldn't stain if I spilled it, but what can I say? I like red wine. And I have to say, I read those comments, but I know some of them aren't real. For instance, I'm pretty sure my son got on there and left a comment because it said something like, your son must be cool, you should buy him a car. To which I said, get off YouTube, you're grounded. Honestly, it's just a lot of fun to see what you think about the videos, what you want to see, and kind of interact on there. So you can leave a comment on this video. I can't wait to see what you think about this Bargello, or if you'll even be the lucky winner who gets to win this Bargello quilt. So here's a second block unit. I just need to sew it together to make my tube, and then it'll be time to slice it up. So I'm gonna cut this tube up just like I did the first one, but in the reverse order. So I'm gonna start with bigger and work to smaller. And speaking of comments, I find that I agree with most of them, like Brenda Day, who said, a glass of wine while you sew, who could ask for more? Well, I think I'd say 2 glasses of wine. Actually, I'm gonna save the second glass for after I remove the stitches. I don't wanna make any silly mistakes. Now I'm gonna remember which fabric is at the top, because that's gonna be very important when it comes time to remove those stitches. On the widest strip, I'm gonna remove the stitching between fabric 1 and fabric 9. And there's the first part. On the second strip, I'm gonna remove the stitching between fabric 8 and fabric 9. So I'm almost going to flip it over. There's 9, there's 8. I'm gonna remove the stitching between those two. On the next strip, I'm gonna remove the stitching between fabrics 7 and 8. Are you sensing a theme here? Speaking of sensing a theme, an awful lot of you are worried that I'm gonna spill my wine. Now, I'll be honest with you, I have not spilled it yet, but trust me, if it happens, I'll leave it in because I think that would be kind of funny in a sad kind of way. Speaking of, I better lower this so I don't risk that. And no, Alan, it's not fabric abuse or alcohol abuse if you spill on your fabric. We'll just call it a happy accident. Now on the last strip, I'm gonna remove the stitching between fabric 6 and fabric 7. Now it's time to sew it together and make my unit. All right, the first one of my B blocks is done. I got the second one finished as well. I'm gonna give them a quick press and then we'll see this whole piece come together. With all the seams in a Bargello block, I think it's important to take a little time and press it nice and flat. So I have my 2 A blocks and my 2 B blocks, and when we lay it out is where we really get to see this design come together. So now this is where we get to see that first glimpse of the Bargello effect. And what I'm loving is the green here because it gives it that cohesive look. The pops of white keep it repetitive also. Now all I have to do is sew these together and I have 1/3 of my quilt finished and ready to go. So here are the 3 sections that make up my quilt, and I'm loving how it's looking. I bet you want to win this quilt, don't you? Are you already thinking about where you might put it in your house? One thing I want to point out is that in each unit, I've made the same fabric selections for each section. You can mix it up though and make it scrappier if you want. That's what's great about this free pattern is you can totally make it yours. Now what I need to do is add the sections in between, and then I'll have the center of my quilt ready to go. The center of the quilt is finished. All I have to do is put a few more borders around the outside and then it's time to quilt. Let's do it. When it comes to Bargello quilts, I have to be honest, deciding how to quilt them is a lot harder than actually piecing them. The trick is, with all these little rectangles, I can never decide, do I quilt each one separately or do an all-over design that enhances the overall curve? Well, I flipped a quarter and I decided that I'm gonna go ahead with some nice elongated swirls that are really gonna follow the curve of the design. I think that's gonna enhance the overall look, and what can I say? I love swirls, they're my favorite. And one lucky person who wins this quilt will probably love them just as much as I do. This design starts with a nice elongated swirl. It doesn't matter how long the swirl is, just that it's elongated so it goes quickly. And then I'm going to echo, echo, echo around it. The next swirl, whenever I'm ready, is going to go ahead and extend past the first one I quilted. And just because I like them to fit together nicely, I'm going to have them face away from each other. And then I'm going to echo, echo, echo. And I'm going to keep adding my swirls, but I'm paying close attention to what the fabric is doing. As I'm quilting up, I notice it's starting to curve back down. So when I finish this swirl, the next one is going to kind of follow that fabric. Now, it's not something that I'm overly worrying about. I'm just kind of using it as a guide, relaxing and just letting the quilting flow. I know it sounds corny, but really it's true. So here's where my other swirl is going to kind of follow that fabric. Now this design is a favorite of mine because it's all about echoing. In fact, I like to joke that one of these days people are going to figure out that all I'm doing is echoing, but until then I'm going to keep doing it. So I still have a lot of quilting left to do, but I really wanted to show you how this is looking. Those swirls are really following the flow of the fabric, just kind of letting the fabric be my guide. Now, if that seems too confusing, don't worry. I've actually put together some free quilting diagrams that you can download to show you how you can quilt your quilt. There's actually 2 options. There's an up all night option, which you can spend a little bit more time quilting, or a turn in early for those of you that have to wake up early the next day that gets the quilting done a little bit quicker. And you can actually download those and the free pattern. Just check out the description box below and you'll find all the information on that. And don't forget to subscribe. I'm gonna keep swirling the night away. I'll show you what it looks like when I'm finished. You asked for it, I listened, and the result was this Bargello quilt pattern that you can get for free. It uses pre-cut 10-inch squares. How fun is that? And it was fun to quilt. Anytime you can use the quilting to enhance the quilt pattern, to me, that's a win-win. By any chance, would you want to win this quilt? Well, you just might. We're gonna pick one lucky winner. All you have to do is subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below, and we'll pick one person to get to take the quilt home. And if you win and you don't want it, well, then I don't mind keeping it for myself. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in a future episode of the Midnight Quilt Show. Happy quilting!